Okay, we have some preliminary housekeeping. Almost ready to start. Here we go. The title of this talk is Clinical Trials and the Elderly. My name is Jay Herson. The main message of this talk is that new drugs must go through extensive clinical trials for safety and efficacy before the FDA will grant a marketing approval for the new drug. However, seniors, say 70 plus, are underrepresented in clinical trials, yet they will be prescribed new drugs without knowledge of safety and efficacy for the elderly patient. The New York Times recognized this problem last year with the headline, "The clinical trial is open. The elderly need not apply." This woman looks concerned about this, and perhaps you are as well. So, as an introduction, first, more about the message, clinical trial axiom, clinical trial as a construct, types of clinical trial, why are seniors underrepresented, the extent of the problem, solutions and resources available to the senior citizen, and interacting with physicians when new drugs are being discussed. What is out of scope in this talk is cost of medicine, health insurance, Medicare, over-the-counter drugs, importing Canadian drugs, supplements, opioids, medical marijuana, all current topics, but nevertheless, we're not our focus today. The message is not that seniors should volunteer for clinical trials. I think after much of what I say, you will not want to. But or the message is also not to say that anyone has been prescribed an unsafe drug, and that will be apparent also later in this talk. Again, the awareness should be new drugs are approved with none or little data on safety and efficacy for the elderly. Seniors should at least be aware of this issue and how is the issue being addressed and how might seniors interact with physicians when drugs are prescribed. First, some terminology. The sponsor. The sponsor is an FDA generalized term for the organization running the clinical trial. Usually, it's a pharmaceutical company. But in the case of a medical device that is manufactured in Germany, say, it might be an American-based importer that is the sponsor of the clinical trial. The NIH might be a sponsor of the clinical trial. And in the case of the congenital diseases of childhood, usually in enzyme efficiency, it's actually a nonprofit parent group that is often the sponsor of the trial. The other term is that we are using generic names only. As an example, omeprazole is the generic name for Prilosec, which is the brand name that you might be familiar with. The reason for using generic names are that during clinical trials, there is only a generic name. The brand name doesn't appear until after the drug is approved. Also, the generic name is used because as a drug enters a generic era, after the patent expires, say 15 years later, different generic companies can now manufacture and market the drug. However, they market it under their own brand names. Also, in Europe, the brand names take on different names in different countries. Um, the word Prilosec in Croatian might mean harmonica, which would not be an appropriate name for a drug. And also, if I were to name the brand names on some of the things I say later, some of you in the audience might get nervous for no reason at all, so it's best to have a little disguise with the generic name. The axiom is that patients in clinical trials are not representative of those seen in practice. And this is not just because of age, for many other factors. But a clinical trial is a construct for deciding if a drug should be marketed. It is not a demonstration of the drug's actual efficacy and safety. The trial results may influence medical practice, but it does not advance medical research the way the NIH-sponsored trials often do. Now, what about a construct? The Motor Vehicle Administration driving test. Whenever I go to the MVA, I see these teenagers sitting on a bench waiting to be called for their road test. The road test is done right there in an obstacle course with stop signs and uh, speed signs or whatever. It looks like a miniature golf course. Um, but does the passing of this test in that controlled environment guarantee that the driver is safe on the road? Does it mean that that teenager can't get the license and go out on the highway and cause an accident? Of course it doesn't. And by the same token, do seniors who drive uh, and who haven't taken a driving test since they were 18 years old demand that the MVA give them a driving test so that they will feel safe and confident? Of course not. There may be two reasons for this. The first might be uh, because they're afraid they might fail the test. But the second is that even if they pass the test, they know intuitively this is a construct and it doesn't really prove that they are safe or that they are as good a driver as they were when they were 18. So why bother? Uh, Drug development. We start with preclinical trials, in animals, mice or rabbits usually. And then there are the phase 1 trials, the feed and bleed trials, phase 2 trials, phase 3, the phase 4 post-market trials. I will discuss these one by one now. The phase 1 trial is the first in humans, small number of subjects, 35 perhaps, done at a single institution. The subjects are normal, healthy volunteers. Uh, However, in oncology, we use patients because of the toxic nature of cancer drugs. And we aim to get the maximum tolerated dose. Um, and This is in order to see how high can we go with the dose with the understanding that a large dose, a high dose is better than a low one, although that isn't always the case. Uh, so uh, because of the normal healthy volunteers, normally seniors are not part of this. Now in oncology, seniors who have already the earlier drugs have already failed the senior patients, cancer patients. They could be put on these phase 1 trials uh, because even though there is no curative intent, there are some good success stories, and it may be the only hope that those patients have. Now, feed and bleed studies. Normal healthy volunteers, almost always college students. Now, so this is not going to be seniors. Single dose of the drug. 36-hour residence with blood work every 4 hours. Now, usually it is male college students. It's very rare for a female college student to volunteer for this kind of thing. The students are paid for this. Um, so 36-hour residence with blood work every 4 hours. We are going to measure the kinetics, the concentration of the drug over time. How long and that's the concentration in the blood. How long does it take for the concentration of the drug to reach its maximum, and how fast does it fall off? All of these characteristics have implications for how successful and how safe the drug may be. Similarly, we have the ADME: absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. We call these four items, we call them the compartments. And how long does the drug stay in each compartment? Too long might mean a safety problem. Too short might be an efficacy problem. And people familiar with this class of drug would sort of intuitively know that from reading the data. Phase 2 now, safety and efficacy are the goals. In patients, small trials, multi-center, that is more than one institution participating, and we want to establish the minimal effective dose. That is, instead of the maximum tolerated now, what is the minimal dose that will give us efficacy? And what are appropriate subpopulations? We may have to go through several phase 2 trials to learn this, but maybe the drug works only with patients who are in early stages of the disease, maybe only those in late stages of the disease, maybe only patients younger than 40. This is what they want to find out. Very few seniors would be on this trial for reasons that I will discuss later. Now comes phase 3. The approval of the drug will be based on data from this trial, and there might be more than one trial, one phase 3 trial. Uh, this is a large global trial, international basis, 1,000 to 2,000 patients participating, maybe even more than 2,000. And we want to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of the drug from what we've learned from the earlier trials. The patients are randomized to experimental or control. The and the trials are placebo controlled except in oncology. And we always want to compare the experimental with the control group. Two biostatisticians meet on the street. One says to the other, "How is your wife?" The other says, "Compared to what?" We're always comparing. Now, in oncology, we do not have placebo controls. Instead, we have what we call an add-on trial. The experimental group would consist of treatment or drug A plus drug B, the control group, drug A. Drug A is an already approved drug for this type of cancer. Drug B is the experimental one, and we want to see, does drug B improve the efficacy without increasing a toxicity risk to the patient? These trials are double blind, meaning neither the investigator nor the patient know what treatment the patient is getting, and this is to reduce bias in reporting of adverse events or efficacy, especially when the efficacy might be like in rheumatoid arthritis, so the efficacy might be more subjective than in other indications. Another definition of a double-blind study that I tell my students is a double-blind study is two surgeons doing research. And usually the students, even those that are surgery residents, enjoy that joke. I hope you did too. And very few seniors, if any, would be on this trial, and I'll explain why. So why no seniors? Well, there are clinical reasons and patient reasons. First, the clinical reasons. Patients on trials cannot be taking any other drugs and cannot have any other diseases or conditions. Common conditions for seniors are diabetes, hypertension, respiratory, and arthritis. And, and the patient cannot have certain family histories. And again, all of this is so that we can better interpret the data. These factors are confounding factors. We don't know, is this adverse event due to they because they have diabetes? Is it due to the drug, etc.? And if the patient is frail, they may not be able to keep their appointments. Maybe they cannot tolerate the protocol dose, and they may drop out for that reason. We still have to submit all of the data. The sponsor may doubt efficacy at reduced doses. So the protocol will say that if the patient has a certain toxicity, the dose can be reduced, say, to half. And that's fine, but we still have to submit all of the data to the FDA. So, say if 1/3 of the patients on the experimental group are seniors over the age of 70, and they all have dose reduction. Well, if the sponsor doubts efficacy at the reduced dose, they don't want to take the chance of submitting the data to the FDA where efficacy won't be shown because those patients are present. There may be a cognitive impairment in the patient, which would make it difficult for them to answer the various questions that they're asked on their clinical appointments. Mobility problems, hearing and vision problems, similar. And what about falls? Is it the effect of the drug or aging? I know from sitting on data monitoring committees that we might, in a clinical trial, have, say, two patients in the experimental group who fall, one in the control group who fall. And we always say, well, these falls could be due just to the aging process and not the drug. But it doesn't really matter because it's only two versus one. So we'll wait to see if there are any more falls. Well, later in the trial, there may be 8 patients in the experimental group and two, and say one in the control group who fall. Now that is a divergence for sure. It's unbalanced results. However, who is to say that the 8 falls in the experimental group, of those 6 were were not due to the drug, but just the aging process, and only 2 were due to the drug. So, I mean, these kinds of discussions have no solution, and this is a reason for not admitting seniors. It has been said that a patient would have to complete a marathon in order to be eligible for a clinical trial. So this woman looks like she might very well be eligible for a clinical trial, uh, but not perhaps many others. Uh, there are also patient reasons for not participating. It interferes with the lifestyle. The patient now has to make many more clinic appointments than they would if they were just being treated by an approved drug. They might have to reside in another city for periods of time. For example, a patient might have some dermatology problem, and the physician says, "Would you like to be in a clinical trial?" And patient says, "Oh, sure." And they say, "Okay." Patient lives in Washington, D.C., and the clinical trial is being conducted in Philadelphia. And the patient might say, "Oh my goodness, I'm not going to go in Philadelphia, stay 3 days every 3 weeks just for this skin rash." Um, and also, the patient is now exposed to new physicians and nurses, a new clinic location, even if it's local. And seniors are finally, they find a physician and a nurse group that they like, a location that's convenient for them. Why would they go to another location for just periods of time. They must complete an informed consent form that explains everything that could possibly go wrong in this clinical trial, all of the side effects that might appear, and they get nervous from that. They also have a fear of being randomized to placebo. 50% chance. Well, you go through all of this trouble, a new physician, a new location, and all they got is the placebo after all. There's also physician judgment involved. The patient's physician may not be aware of the clinical trial or knows this would not work uh, for for work out for this patient. They wouldn't be able to keep uh, the uh, the appointments. They may not be tolerant of a new physician. Uh, and the physician has good experience with a generic drug that he knows has worked, been using it for 15 years. Why expose the patient to a clinical trial? Also, we have the prescription to over-the-counter switches, Tagamet and Prilosec, drugs that you may know, started out as prescription drugs, but now at a lower dose, they're over the counter drugs. But the lower dose might work very well for the senior patient, and it can be obtained at the pharmacy. Now, ibuprofen went in the other direction. It started out as a prescription as a over-the-counter drug, but a higher dose was made prescription, and people who may undergo certain kinds, maybe an eye infection or uh, uh, an eye inflammation, I mean, or had undergone a dental surgery, are familiar with ibuprofen or acetaminophen in its prescription form. Now, the average senior is taking 4 prescription drugs and 2 over the counter drugs. So, again, this is a reason why they're not allowed on clinical trials. The clinical concerns of uh, patients being exposed to a new drug are the effect on falls, incontinence, heart disease, and drug-drug interactions. If the patient is already taking a drug, we don't know, even for the younger patient, what interaction the new drug might have with the other drugs the patient is taking. And this is more acute for the senior patient. And the senior physiology is there are changes in kidney metabolism and renal clearance, not the same as for younger patients. Now, these two changes in physiology usually do not pose a problem for the senior in any way. However, it could affect their tolerance of drugs or the efficacy of drugs, and that would not be known until we have some experience with them in the senior population. Now, in oncology, patients over 75, the way the lines of this is read, I have put in the interpretation of the first line of this chart. Breast cancer. 19% of breast cancer patients are 75 plus, but only 4% are on clinical trials. 33% of colon patients are 75 plus, but only 8% on clinical trials. And if you take the second to last line, the largest number, 81% of pancreatic patients are 75 plus, but only 40% are on clinical trials. And that's because, why is the number higher? The number is higher is that's the market. That is where they're going to find pancreatic patients. And there are so many of them out there that they may very well find enough that can run the marathon. Overall, 61% of cancer patients are 75 plus, but only 32% are represented on clinical trials. So that shows, at least for cancer, the extent of the problem. We can go into it looking at it a different way for other diseases. Alzheimer's, less than 33% of seniors are eligible for clinical trials. 52% of gastrointestinal patients over 65 are receiving substandard care because physicians are afraid to put them on uh, newly approved drugs because there's no experience with the over 65 population. Seniors constitute 42% of all prescription drugs, 60% of the disease burden. Only 32% of seniors are on trials overall, all indications. Alzheimer's, arthritis, epilepsy, incontinence, and cardiovascular clinical trials, 15 to 35% of seniors are on these trials. In other diseases, type 2 diabetes trials, 65% excluded by age alone, 76% for comorbidity, meaning they have the other indications, the other chronic diseases. Um, Osteoporosis, 23% of trials exclude patients for age alone. The mean age of an osteo clinical trial participant is 65 years. The mean age of patients presenting with hip fractures in the clinic is 83 years. Again, an underrepresentation. The Milwaukee Journal Sentinel did an excellent job on a series um, investigating FDA warnings and safety of FDA approved drugs. In one of the articles, they show that 13 out of 21 biologics recently approved by FDA have warnings that were added after drug approval because patients on the trials were not representative, not necessarily by age, but not representative. Seniors take biologics for rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, Crohn's disease, and of course cancer, and others. Now, the one drug I know of is infliximab, an immunosuppressive drug. And they did discover early deaths due to heart failure among seniors in the early post-market, and then later a warning was put on that seniors should probably not be taking this drug, and that's because the seniors were not represented on the clinical trials. Now, there are good news. The AGS is the American Geriatric Society. The AGS has the Beers criteria for new drugs used in the elderly. There's pooling of data from physician electronic health records and what is known as the CALIF Clinical Trial Enterprise. I'm going to discuss each of these individually. The American Geriatric Society has the Beers criteria. Committees of physicians and nurses go over data from FDA voluntary reports, insurance claims data, clinical trial results, pooled since 1991 and updated annually. The drugs, they list the drugs unsafe for the elderly because of side effects, but also what the efficacy is insufficient at the tolerable dose. That is, with the recognition that the tolerable dose for seniors is less than ideal. And and the committees have seen there's not efficacy at that tolerable dose. This is a warning for physicians not to use this drug on a patient. And they also indicate, is the strength of evidence weak, moderate, or strong? The evidence would be weak if it's just maybe 7 or 8 case reports, moderate if it comes from one clinical trial, and strong if it comes from all of these insurance claims, voluntary reports, clinical trials, etc. Now, I'll go over now adverse events discovered in the elderly after drug approval. First, the NSAIDs, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. In these two drugs, I won't read the names of the drugs, but you can see them. For these two drugs, the adverse events found were ulcers and internal bleeding. For these muscle relaxants, the adverse events were risk of falls, constipation, and a dry mouth. For these anti-anxiety drugs, diazepam, uh, and well, I shouldn't be reading the names of the drugs anyway. But I do believe diazepam is a drug that has been married many times. It has 5 brand names, but its first married name was um, oh, I can't think of it now. Valium. It was Valium. And zolpidem is known as Ambien. The adverse events found were cognitive impairment, delirium, extended grogginess, falls, and fractures. And for the anticholinergic drugs that are shown, adverse events, cognitive impairment, delirium, extended grogginess, falls, and fractures as well. And the antipsychotic drugs, tremors, and falls. Now, the biggest risk to seniors is drugs recently approved. Those are the ones you see advertised on TV, especially in the 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock national news. Um, so an analogy might be never buy a car in its first model year. Don't buy a brand new house. These aren't exactly analogies, but you might consider them to be a similar. Um, Remember, a disease is a product line, and physicians are the sales force. The pharma companies have, you name the disease, they have a drug for every stage of that disease. And the physicians are trained by the sales staff to explain the benefits of these various drugs in the product line. So let the buyer beware. Now, FDA has what they call the drug trial snapshots. This is new. This started in the Obama era. And the idea, these are drugs listed here, some of the drugs approved in 2017. They don't give any results or any side effects in this drug trial snapshots, and they are available on the internet. And they do refer to the drugs for brand name because they're approved drugs, and this is a communication between to consumers, so they use the brand name. Um, they will give the percent of patients over 65 that were on the clinical trials that were the basis of approval. So you see the first 4, lymphoma, lung cancer, venous thromboembolism, and glaucoma. For the venous thromboembolism, 90% were over 65. Well, there are so many patients over 65 that have this condition, and there are enough that could run the marathon. So they are gladly admitted. Similarly for lymphoma, lung cancer, and glaucoma, for sure. Now, when you get to the others, the next list, skin infection, dermatitis, etc., small percentages. And the reason is there are many patients younger than 65 that qualify for these trials and who have these conditions and can run the marathon. So that's why we see smaller percentages. And by the way, for the oncology drugs, those first 2, I don't know. Those patients may have been on phase 1 trials. I don't know that they were on phase 3 trials. As I said before, the phase 1 trials sometimes admit cancer patients who have where the drug has failed them, the drugs they've had previously has failed them. Um, Now, you would think safety and efficacy issues are well understood for the elderly for drugs on the market for a long time, like especially the generic era drugs. Drugs get off patent about 12 years after approval, and that's when we say the generic era begins. But the elderly are very heterogeneous, and taking multiple drugs and they are taking multiple drugs and different supplements, many chronic conditions, inconsistent doses and schedules, so that we we don't know for enough for a given patient. And Cimetidine, in fact, you may know it as Tagamet. They discovered mental status changes years after it was first approved for ulcers. Now, as you know, many patients take the cimetidine and they don't have this. It's not a lot of patients, but nevertheless, it took many years because of the heterogeneity to find this out. Now, also, we are now pooling what we call real world evidence. Cancer Link is a product of ASCO, the American Society for Clinical Oncology. This is actually an international organization of oncologists. And all of these oncologists are using uh, electronic medical records all over the world. And they are sending their records to a central pooling place. And they are, and the central pooling place, whatever the format is of the electronic medical record, it's converted to a common format, and any oncologist can now get access to the data. So someone comes in and I've never seen a patient who is 90 that has their breast cancer and has this also has diabetes or whatever, and is on this other drug and can't get off the drug. Um, there is a good chance the physician will find a patient like that uh, who was treated with a particular drug that the physician is considering. Uh, and It's not a lot of patients, perhaps. It's not randomized patient, but it's the best that they can have. And physicians are finding this helpful. The Sentinel data is the FDA's collaboration with several health insurers, with Medicare, all the data pooled, and FDA is using those data post-market to advise the community of possible problems with seniors. Um, the FDA MedWatch program has existed for many decades. It's a voluntary program for physicians whenever they see a side effect in a patient to send the report in. There's a lot of underreporting here, but we hope that for seniors, they would send the reports in. Other groups are doing the same. Um, and and we're learning how to analyze these data to reduce bias. We don't have randomized controlled studies, but there's some bias there, but we are learning how to deal with that. Um, Now, recently, Zostavax. Zostavax is a vaccine for herpes zoster. It's a shingles. And for FDA approval, the sponsor did a randomized placebo-controlled trial of 22,000 subjects. We don't say patients because these are normal patients and they only took age 50 to 59. Normal patients age 50 to 59. They follow them, and here it was for a median follow-up of 1.3 years to see what is the incidence of herpes zoster in the patients. Now, age 50 to 59 is considered optimal because, as you know, the herpes zoster is a chickenpox um, virus that has been dormant for at least 40 years. And that is when we begin, if it is going to become alive and active again, it will be in this age group. And the age group is under 65 for all of the other reasons. That is a good one. By the way, viruses. A virus walks into a bar and the bartender says, "We don't serve your kind here." The virus says, "You're not a good host." That was meant to be another joke. I've exhausted my repertoire. Okay, back to the slide. The median follow-up was 1.3 years, and there was a reduction in herpes zoster incidence by 70% in the group that got the active vaccine. But the sponsor had to agree to a post-marketing commitment, meaning they had to do an observational study of 1.3 million Kaiser Permanente members. 350,000 received Zostavax, not randomized. What I mean by that, there were 1.3 million Kaiser Permanente members. The physician said, you might want to consider at your convenience getting this new herpes zoster shingles vaccine. And you know, some patients do and some patients do not. And so 350,000 decided they would get the vaccine. So now there's more data for the 50 to 59 age group, but also for 60 to 69, 70 to 79, and 80 plus. This is good news. Now, it is true the data for the 60 plus group was not available when it was the Zostavax was approved, but it is available later, and now physicians have that information. And there is about a 60% reduction in the older groups. And the combination of data like this with the post-marketing commitment, I think, is the future for all drugs. A drug will be approved. It will wear a scarlet letter for the first 5 years after approval, meaning it's been approved, but a post-marketing commitment of an observational study is in progress. And some patients and physicians might say, well, I will take this drug after the scarlet letter is removed. And that is fair, and it's a fair disclosure for everybody. Now, Robert Califf is an MD. He was Vice Chancellor for Health Sciences at Duke, and then he came to be the Commissioner of the FDA in the last year of the Obama administration. But he had the idea for the clinical trial enterprise. Under this, the patient visits his or own physician. They say, here, I have these symptoms. An electronic medical record pops up, and a list of clinical trials accepting patients for this patient's condition and eligibility also pops up. If the patient agrees, this physician, their own, will be the investigator on the clinical trial. The patient will be randomized to the experimental or the control group, still a double-blind study, and this may be the only patient that this physician puts on the clinical trial. But the physicians in their residency will be trained how to conduct a clinical trial, even if it's for just one patient from time to time, in their training. So now seniors will be accepted in the trial in their own stratum. By that I mean the seniors will be in the trial. Now, the FDA can use the traditional stratum of patients who can complete the marathon for their own drug approval. But nevertheless, senior data will be available to all physicians. And those that can complete the marathon, by the way, will also be treated by their own physicians. So this is considered a more pragmatic trial rather than a trial being done by physicians who wear a cap and gown at a teaching hospital. So clinical trials could be done in a building like this rather than in this sprawling complex on the banks of the Charles River. Interacting with physicians now. Well, this says, when I said you could tell me anything, I didn't mean that you could tell me you think I'm losing my hair, although most patients would not say that to their physician. Anyway, ask what evidence he or she has of efficacy and safety for a person in your demographic group and health history. This has nothing to do with clinical trials now. The physician is discussing a new drug. What evidence do you have? Has he or she consulted the Beers list and look and see if they look at you with a blank face? Have you just have you looked at the FDA's drug trial snapshots to see what percent of seniors were were represented in the new drug application? And are there alternative drugs where more evidence has accumulated for use in the elderly? These are four good questions to ask when interacting with a physician. So I hope you think there is a happy ending to this issue. These two seniors seem to be happy with the ending. I hope you are too, and I hope you are happy with my presentation. Thank you.